Good morning, everybody. Reed here. Good afternoon. Today, we're going to have a very interesting conversation. Um, if you haven't heard the news, a white wing white. I'm not really a political analyst, so I don't want to go into the area involving the politics or anything like that. Um, I wanted to sort of go into I wanted to touch bases on this situation because I kind of felt it was relevant to the singularities here. So I'm doing a series called "The Singularities here," and this series is about the moment at which AI becomes more smarter than man, right? And when AI is projected that when AI becomes more smarter than man, then there's no point in the people who own the AIs or run the AIs. There's no point in hiring you, right? So my discussion on the singularity is here means you have to start preparing for change that's about to come. This change that's about to come is irreversible. And this change is actually, this is the transition point for all of humanity. Look, you are so fortunate that you are blessed enough to be born in the transition, the actual transition between the information age and the industrial age, and the industrial revolution, the intersection between the industrial revolution and the information age. We're right there at this intersection. And what we're seeing now, let me show you this here. What we're seeing now is we're seeing all the major players get together and begin to compete for their interests in running a planet. Let me see, G and Kim. When all the bad guys take a picture together, when all the bad guys take a picture together, something's up, and I'm not sure if Russia is the toughest of the three. I think it's likely China, right? And so what we're seeing now is a demolition of Ukraine. So it's a complete demolition, right? And that's like the number 2 spot. So these three represent mainly the interests of the global South. And I think those interests, they're building systems that are outcompeting the ones we designed 80 years ago, right? And here we are. The last 2 weeks shook the world order. Xi, Putin, and Kim showed how closely they will work to end American dominance. And Trump played into their hands. Like, it's getting serious, y'all. We need to see what impact is this going to have on the South Side of Chicago. And I think the South Side of Chicago needs to start talking about these things, right? I mean, I don't think we should talk about going to heaven anymore, right? I think civil rights is done. Civil rights is done. And none of the leaders, Jesse Jackson, Farrakhan, I mean, you get your host, but I don't see any of the civil rights leaders really speaking up against things now. So I think they're effectively muted because their overlords basically silenced them. But this is a concerning thing here, right? Now, it's been 80 years since the end of World War II. And so all of the businesses, all of the companies, all of the networks, all of the buildings, all of the tools, none of those things are efficient anymore. The vehicles we built at the beginning of the Industrial Revolutions cannot service as vehicles now. They serve as mopeds now. We have mopeds that are better designed than the cars and go faster and safer, right, and less expensive. right? So those cars we built 80 years ago will never survive on the expressway, perform on the expressway. And so we need new cars, right? And so we're looking into flying cars now. And just like the automobile industry, like you could not keep the car your grandparents had that they were so proud of, it wouldn't work for today. So if that's cars, just look at buildings, just look at companies, just look at fabrics, you know what I'm saying? Let's say food choices. I mean, how long is McDonald's going to last? You know what I'm saying? They may, 100 years from now, they may taste the fast food now and say, all right, how could they eat this stuff? Can you imagine going back drinking like pop now, straight from the can and things like that? It's hard to even do those things now. So the point here is that all of the things we built over 80 years, it doesn't work efficiently or effectively enough to get us to profits now. We need newer systems. So this is taking place globally. So right now, all the people who are fighting for position are doing two things. Number one, trying to achieve technological superiority, and number two, trying to control your ego, right? And so we're going to see how this Charlie Kirk assassination sort of plays into this. Here's how I think this is sort of important. Let me see here. Okay, look. Hold on one second. Okay. Okay. Let me. Okay. First, let me go through Charlie Kirk. Okay. Let me see who Charlie Kirk is and why I think this is a significant. Let me see why I think this is a significant issue. So that's the backdrop. The backdrop is we're at this junction at 80 years where all of the systems that existed in the past would have to be dismantled because they are no longer effective. They can no longer drive profits the same way because they're not as sophisticated and they're not as technical, not as sophisticated or not as efficient. So we need to create new systems in order to get the productivity and the benefit out of it. Now, at these junctions, there's usually climactic changes. I mean, there's usually intense conflict, and I'm concerned about this being the initiation of political violence and or retaliation within the United States. The reason why that is important is that the reason why this is important to the south side of Chicago is when the larger community felt threatened, they typically retaliated with government policies and laws that targeted poor black people on the south side of Chicago. That's the reason why this is important, right? So the reason, and I'm going to take you through the reasoning for this. Now remember, after every transition between humanity, the larger community always came up with ways to actually exploit the south side of Chicago and African Americans in this country, right? So let's look back at the end of slavery. So at the end of slavery, there was something called the Freedmen's Bureau, where you were slave, but you didn't have properties. You had rights, but nobody would enforce them. So what the larger community started doing is taking African Americans and putting them under guardianships, going to a court and saying, I'm your guardian. And because they had your guard, they became your guardian. They were able to access all your resources, control your resources that were entitled to you. So after the end of slavery, they came up with this huge guardianship process that basically exploited the resources of the freed African Americans. Right now, that was at the transition. That was at the that was at the end of the Civil War, which was the transition between the agricultural age and the information age, right? So after the Civil War, they came with things called the Freedmen Bureaus and guardianships over African Americans, right? Then, 80 years later, we're at the point. Then after the Freedmen's Bureau, then they came up with the Jim Crow regulation, right? And so the Jim Crow laws and the Constitution had that African Americans were 3/4 humans. We were considered not real humans, but African Americans were considered 3/4 humans back then. I believe in the Constitution or something like that. Look it up. I don't want to misquote, but look it up. Right. But at the end of the Civil War, that transition between the agricultural age and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they became guardianships and laws like that in order to disenfranchise you. So the Civil Rights Movement fought that issue until it basically won it, mainly in the 70s and things, really in the 70s and things like that. Now, after the Civil Rights Movement, let's look here what happened in the Chicago. So after the 60s, at the beginning of the 70s, in the Civil Rights Movement, then we started getting the heroin epidemic that hit Chicago on the south side of Chicago. And mainly it was pumped in by people outside of the community pushing the drugs into the poor population. And after the opiate epidemic, then they kicked off the crack revolution. So they began to pump crack into the community, right? Then after that, they with civil rights legislations, African Americans were able to move and relocate into neighborhoods and compete for jobs and opportunities and things like that. In response to that, you got the war on drugs, which was a federal response. And then you got the prison industrial complex. And these two systems decimated, really did a lot of damage to the families on the south side of Chicago. It didn't break the families, and it still haven't broken the families. I believe the south side is unbreakable. And the south side is one of these communities that's been resistant to a lot of the structural racism and the things that is the people have been exploited because of. It's been resistant to all those things. So civil rights led to people getting jobs, education, housing. And in Chicago, particularly the south side of Chicago in the late 50s and early 60s, that changes in civil rights legislation and the changes resulted in white flight out of Chicago into the surrounding suburbs. So 30 years of white flight led to the removal of the tax base on the south side of Chicago, and therefore repeated episodes of disinvestment, malinvestment, exploitation. The residents on the south side of Chicago have been pummeled by the racist behavior of the governments, the corporations, and the people who come on the south side and actually work. It seems like the south side is a huge exploitation field for the people. And the people entering the community sort of understand that the people in this community have difficulty accessing their rights. But in response to the civil rights movement, you got the white flight out of Chicago, you got the tax base destroyed, the demonizing, how they demonize Black men as drug dealers and crack cocaine, even though the African Americans were a minor number of people actually using cocaine. They devalued the whole thing. Remember the Hillary Clinton's the super predator. All of a sudden, a black man is a super predator and things like that. This rhetoric infiltrated the families, where it became best for some families to sort of export the care of their loved ones to the government via jail or prison or hospitals, than to actually manage the problems themselves. Right? This became too much for the families on the south side of Chicago. And so the war on drugs, the prison industrial complex, the cocaine epidemic, the heroin epidemic, all of these things have continued to batter families. Probably there's a new game coming out, what, every 5 to 7 years by the government or some other psychopath that's coming through the neighborhood. It's a different game that the families have to survive all the time. So the reaction to those civil rights victories were this. So my concern here is Charlie Kirk was a right-wing political activist, and he was assassinated. And I'm concerned about him being used as a figure to justify further exploitation in the future. So this is awful, what happened to him, but my concern is that this may galvanize a response that then may need to lead to more targeting of people on the south side of Chicago, meaning looking. So I think it's important to start preparing for this, start looking for ways that the government or law enforcement starts to devalue you, look for other ways, look for things that they're law enforcement is focusing on. But I'm sort of concerned about the possibility of a response. And I think I'm concerned that the response they'll likely come up with is a response that's based upon an information age type of oppression, not the type of oppression you saw in the agricultural age. The type of oppression you had in the agricultural age, you had the capacity to protest because you were a slave. So you can protest labor. But in this situation, with exploitation that may happen through the information age, those tools render you useless. So they don't have to deal with you anymore in order to exploit you. They only have to lock you out of the game. So here, James Kirk was an American right-wing political activist, author, and media personality. He co-founded the conservative organization Turning Point USA. It's an American nonprofit organization that advocates for conservative politics on high school, college, and university campuses. Yeah. And let me see white wing politics. White wing politics is the range of political ideologies that view certain social orders and hierarchies as inevitable, natural, normal, or desirable, typically supporting the position favoring natural law, meaning they believe there's a hierarchy, right? They believe they're at the top. Economics, authority, property, religion, tradition, hierarchy, and inequality may be seen as a natural result of traditional social differences or competition in the market economies. The belief system is that you're not as equal, So this is something I'm very concerned about, And so one of the things I would hope you would do is sort of start thinking about some of these things and making sure that you go through the process of keeping you and your family safe. So if you're on the south side of Chicago, I would hope that you would follow this issue very closely. And I think you're going to have to start doing everything you can to mainly, I would think, get off the south side of Chicago. I think right now it's to there's not enough services or support for the families over there. So if you had to relocate, I would definitely relocate to a community that's not being targeted as much. The problem with being on the south side has nothing to do with the actual south side. The problem with the south side is the south side has not been able to curtail or stop the predators that enter the south side. If you can handle the predators, then the community won't be that disruptive. But there's, right at this point, there's almost no way to control the predators, right? And you can't arrest people for pre-crimes. You can arrest for pre-crimes, and we look at your history and just put you in jail. It's not going to work. So it's a pleasure to talk to you about this. If you have any other questions, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share. And remember, watch out what these people are going to be doing. It's going to be something else. Read out. I'll talk to you later. Take care of yourself, guys. Ciao.